right, this is part 2 of the Next Generation Science Standards for Secondary Education, Introduction to the Structure and Intent of the Document. If you recall, in part 1 we ended here on this slide, and I focused us on the idea that the document is separated into 3 basic sections: the upper section, the middle section, and the bottom section. I want to go into more detail on each of these sections in this part 2 of the series. Here is a standard that I've taken from the middle school standards. The upper part is this portion here that is white with black lettering and some red lettering underneath. And this is called the Performance Expectation section. I want to take a moment to go over the lettering and numbering system. MS stands for middle school, PS stands for physical science, and 4 stands for, this is the 4th disciplinary core idea in the physical science section. So once again, this is MS PS 4, middle school physical science disciplinary core idea 4. And then they give you the name of the disciplinary core idea here. This is the idea that waves and their applications in technology for information transfer. Okay. In this particular section, there are 3 performance expectations. The next section, this color-coded section, is called the 3 dimensions. 3 dimensions, first one is the science and engineering practices, that is SEP. Second one is the disciplinary core ideas, that's the DCI. Finally, the third one is the cross-cutting concepts, that's the CCC. And the bottom portion of the document is what I refer to as the correlations. It's this white section down here with the black writing. So once again, we have 3 sections: performance expectations, 3 dimensions, and correlations. Every one of the set of standards in the Next Generation Science Standards is set up in the same format, whether it's kindergarten or 12th grade or anything in between. Let's go into more detail on each of these sections. Standards, or the performance expectations for students. Now, I just want to emphasize that all I've done is cut off the top of the document that we saw on the last slide. And this is the portion of the document that is called the performance expectations. As I said before, there are 3 performance expectations in this particular portion of the standards, and I'm going to highlight the middle of these 4 standards. This is Middle School Physical Science 4-2. Now in this case, the -2 just simply states that this is the second of the performance expectations in this disciplinary core idea. So we have all the physical science 4 disciplinary, all of the performance expectations within the disciplinary core idea 4, and there are 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3. That's what those numbers mean, numbers and letters. Okay, so what are performance expectations? Well, they are the standards. They are what sometimes are referred to as the new standards. So if people ask you, do we have standards in California? Yes, we do. They are the performance expectations. Once again, I want to emphasize this. I'm saying it for the 3rd time. Performance expectations are the standards. This is what your students are going to be expected to do after your unit of instruction. So in this case, the one that I've highlighted says that students are expected to develop and use a model to describe that waves are reflected, absorbed, or transmitted through various materials. So what is the standard? The expectation that students will be able to develop and use a model. And the purpose of the model is to describe how, or the ways in which waves are reflected, absorbed, and transmitted through various materials. It's a pretty complicated standard. The assessment boundary clarification and statement are guides for teachers. What is this assessment boundary and clarification? It is the red lettering that is underneath the standard. So the red lettering is not part of the standard. It's actually a clarification for the standard, and it describes what the boundaries of assessment are. So I want to state right here, the red portion here says in the clarification statement, emphasis is on both light and mechanical waves. So they're clarifying here, when they say waves, they are intending teachers to emphasize both mechanical waves, such as sound waves, and electromagnetic waves, light waves. An example of models could include drawings, simulations, and written descriptions. So they are clarifying what they mean by a model in this case. Could be a drawing, could be a simulation, could be a description. Finally, this portion here called assessment boundary, it tells where the students will be assessed at this grade level. Assessment is limited to qualitative applications pertaining to light and mechanical waves. This is intended to differentiate it from quantitative analysis, which would be done in a higher grade level. Okay, so in this case, students would not be expected to do anything beyond describing qualitatively how waves are transmitted through materials. In this case, they would be looking for things such as refraction and diffraction, things of that nature. Students will be assessed on the performance expectations. This is critically important. This is where students will be assessed. They will be assessed to see if they can develop and use a model. That is what they're going to be assessed on. So these are the new standards. The performance expectations are the standards. Let me go into the anatomy of the performance expectation. So here I have highlighted the performance expectation, and I pulled it out and enlarged it so I can, in essence, pull it apart. Develop and use a model. That's part of the performance expectation. And if you remember, in the document, the middle portion called the 3 dimensions includes this blue section called the science and engineering practices. I want to emphasize this portion right here. It says developing and using models. So one of the science and engineering practices is develop and use models, and in this particular standard they are using that practice. Notice here this portion of the standard is saying that waves are reflected, absorbed, and transmitted. Notice that in the disciplinary core ideas, electromagnetic radiation, students are expected to know that electromagnetic radiation travels in the form of waves. And so in this standard, there is both a science practice and a disciplinary core idea. Finally, the cross-cutting concept that is used in this section is called structure and function, and it says that structures can be designed to serve particular functions by taking into account properties of different materials. And so here we're seeing that the cross-cutting concept is that different materials have different properties. So, for example, the transmission of electromagnetic radiation would be different through glass, for example, than it would be through plastic. They have different indices of refraction and so forth. Okay, so what I want to be really clear on here is that a performance expectation is made up of 3 portions. It's made up of the science practice, the disciplinary core idea, and the cross-cutting concept. Very important to note, again, that the performance expectation is the standard. Sometimes people get confused. I want to ask the question, is a science practice the standard? The answer is no, it's not a standard, but a science practice is in every standard. Another question, are the disciplinary core ideas the standards? The answer to that is no, but every standard does have a disciplinary core idea in it. Finally, are the cross-cutting concepts the standards? The answer is no again, but every standard has a cross-cutting concept in it. What is the standard is the performance expectation, which is made up, and every standard is made up the same way, of one practice, one core idea, and one cross-cutting concept. These are called the three dimensions of the standards, because every standard includes one of each of these three dimensions. Why did the framers do this? By the way, if you'll notice, I've changed to a second grade standard here, Physical Science 1, 4th standard. Okay, it's the same structure as the middle school standard, but in this case, it's just a little bit easier to see. I just want to emphasize that the reason that the framers did this is because in the old standards, the practices were part of a separate section of the standards, and teachers took that intention to mean that they would teach the practices separately. And so often what you would have is teachers would give a unit at the beginning of the year on the scientific method. After 2 weeks, they would stop that unit and they would move on to a unit on, for example, structure of the cell, and then they would forget completely about the science practices. So students would learn the scientific method at the beginning of the year and then never use it the entire year, and all through the year they would be taught content, and by the end of the year they had no concept whatsoever of how the practices or how scientific method was used in science. So the framers intentionally wove the practices into every standard so that built into the standard is both a practice, a cross-cutting concept, and a disciplinary core idea to emphasize how those three dimensions are interdependent and important to scientific practice. So the symbol that you will see is this Mobius strip showing that every standard has a practice, a core idea, and a cross-cutting concept. Again, core ideas are not the standards, but they are part of every standard. Cross-cutting concepts are not the standards, they are part of every standard. And the science practices are not the standards, but they are part of every standard. So in the middle portion of the document, you will see each of these individual dimensions highlighted or color-coded for your reference. These are, again, not the standards, but they are portions of the standards. At the bottom of the document were correlations. The first section of correlations here correlates to other DCIs within the grade level or grade band. So this would show you correlations to other DCIs within middle school if it were a middle school standard. The second group of correlations correlates to other DCIs from other grade levels. So this would tell which standard or which DCIs these correlated to in high school and in elementary school if you are looking at a middle school standard. The next group of correlations correlate to the Common Core ELA standards and finally the Common Core math standards. So at the bottom of every standards document you will find this white section that tells not only what other DCIs are correlated to these standards, but also the Common Core literacy standards and math standards.